I mean, I guess photography is fundamentally about framing a piece of the, is making available a piece of the world, and also like to us through a frame. And one is, and let's say setting aside recent digital work, mostly it's about the observation of people in place and how they're interacting. I mean, so I guess class standard entry point for me would have been Cartier-Bresson, Decisive Moment, that kind of, you know, this idea of that perfect balance. That always seemed deeply relevant to architecture. Um, and from there, I mean, so I'm very interested in urban photography, like street photography, but other ways of registering the interaction of people and city, um, and the way that, and I'm also quite interested in the act of photographing, the being of the being a photographer, the how you're operating in the place. Um, like say Thomas Struth standing in the middle of a street in New York for an hour, looking into a viewfinder, producing a certain kind of image vis-a-vis Gary Winogrand, not even holding, not even like putting the camera in front of his face, vis-a-vis Helen Levitt, like shooting at 90 degrees. So like the practice of photography and the occasion and the opportunity given by the city for a certain kind of seeing of a certain kind of subject that you cannot, you know, you can't. So there's these odd sort of, on the one hand, people are anonymous in the city. On the other hand, they're hugely visible almost all of the time, you know. And photography has an opportunity, as in Walker Evans shooting on the subway, or Philip Lorca de Corsia making his Head series, you know, of the like of anonymous faces in the crowd that become deeply, it's a kind like a kind of portraiture. So you can be up close to people and photographing them actually by virtue of size, scale, anonymity, these kind of things. So I think it also complicates the reading of the standard kind of early 20th century reading of the city as a place of anonymity and, you know, the Siegfried Kracauer kind of version. Well, yes, but there's also there is a great capacity to develop selfhood in that kind of context.
I mean, it's interesting because there's also in a way that you talk about it, it feels that there's like a performative element to it, both of the photographer but also of the
Exactly.
subject.
But also of the subject, and you might say of the viewer, you know.
Yeah.
So, but I like, so like the way I would have, I mean, I wrote a book about it, which was basically a set of essays that were, it's mostly through kind of case studies of particular bodies of work, that like a photo book particularly, or let's say Struth's Unconscious Places series, or Lorca de Corsia's Heads, or so that would be the way. And then you're trying to understand the making of those pictures. It's very straightforward. It's not high theory at all. It's rather a sort of act of sympathy with the with the practice of the making of the photograph. And somehow that the kind of attention that's paid by the photographer is something I think that's important for architecture, you know.
And do you think that there is a kind of phenomenological sensibility in photography? Is that something that you've ever sort of come across or engaged with, the kind of
I think
observation?
I think I'm less I'm yeah, I'm actually more interested in the I don't want to say the psychological aspect of it, like the questions of, yes, actually of selfhood and of self knowledge and of not not subjectivity exactly, but well, yeah, subjectivities, more so than phenomenology. So, like say with Struth, to go back to that, the idea of the unconscious of a, like if when you say unconscious places, are we meaning that the city itself has an unconscious? Are we meaning that it's something we absorb unconsciously? Are we meaning that it's something that somehow represents an unconscious for us? Is it the unconscious of the photographer, of the viewer? And And I mean, he when he was making those photographs, he was making portraits at the same time, and he was interested in Gestalt theory particularly, and so on. So there's a question of how the making of an image, what role does the making of an image have? Do you know what I mean? In the exploration of or revelation of a state of mind. That. So to an extent, it's like the collective. It goes back to that the Rossi thing of the collective memory of a city, you know. So a lot of it is tied to cityness, I have to say. I mean, it like almost, you know, the city, like the urban imaginary, those kind of ideas. Like obviously, photography is central in that, the constructing of the urban imaginary at any given moment. But I think it's central in framing our understanding of, as I say, how the human subject interacts with the city.
And is there something in the reproductive nature of photography that is interesting?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, well, to the extent that it's something that is often intended for, that's often, it's not, it's intended for publication, maybe in some way, like is in it's printed and it's shown, or it's printed, it's put in a book. Like my starting point would mostly be the photo book, actually, if you know what I mean. So there's a sort of, because there's a whole set of other decisions in that, isn't there, about how you're, like William Klein would present an image rather than, you know, captions, no captions, like Walker Evans, to go back to Walker Evans' American Photographs, that the kind of grammar of the photo book and how and how you're using that to, and he famously didn't really care about, you know, he would always cut up pictures and show them at different sizes, different crops and all kinds of things. He had no preciousness about the image or the artifact. So yeah, to that extent, yeah, that's part of it, isn't it? Yeah.
But so what's interesting about photo book is that obviously it's a sequence of photographs, as well as a series of either diptychs or multiple photographs or a single image across 2 pages. That maybe it's an interesting way it kind of connects us to film.
Yes.
In an interesting way.
Yeah. Oh, it does. It does. Yeah. But then it's also, I think the way you experience it is very different. Like you experience the book in as a thing. I mean, I do also think like there's something about the photographer, like with exceptions, it's a solitary, lonely thing, and it's a kind of very much you're on your own. You're on your own. You're left to your own devices, and it's left to you to sort of understand whether something is worth pursuing or has value as picture or whatever, and then to start to construct that as part of a larger project, and then make that project. So it's incredibly intimate, I think, ultimately, because ultimately then it's I mean, no more than any book, but somehow the sitting with a book, looking at pictures that somebody made, usually on their own in the world, if you know what I mean. There's something like, which I think is quite different than cinema, you know, which is like it's an industrial production, even at the smallest scale, and it's consumed in, well, yes, of course it can be consumed individually, but it's mostly a collective experience. So I think the privacy of the book, which a lot of people kind of play with, I think, as well. But then, yes, sequence, flow, all of those things have things in common with film.
I feel like from here, there's many ways in which I'd love to talk to you about this, because on one level, I want to talk about how do you sort of educate architects? How can photography, a medium of book, be helpful to an education of an architect? So maybe let's start with that.
Okay, but just maybe I'm happy to do that. I thought we were going to be talking about Shane DeBlacam and Louis.
No, we will.
Oh, we will.
Wait.
Okay. All right. Okay.
We will. I'm getting to him.
Getting there. Okay. Okay.
But I do think it's important
I'm interested in your
I
method.
also am really interested in what you do.
Well, okay. So how does, I mean, I guess we do this a lot because I mean, in terms of teaching, I've taught a lot of seminars on photography,
Hmm.
like in various ways, relationship of photography and architecture. And I work a lot with colleagues who are both photographers and architects. So there's often an aspect in teaching of inviting students to
Hmm.
work, you know. Um, so there's a number of ways in. I mean, I think the way in is this thing of attentiveness to what is there,
Hmm.
and ways of registering the ways, you might say, ways of registering, like for want of a better word, a site, or a location, a territory that you're going to be operating in, that the kind of noticing that you have to, I mean, I know on the one hand people say, oh, people make photographs all the time, they don't think about it, blah blah blah, it's kind of a meaningless medium because it proliferates so much. But still, I think actually the minute you begin to start thinking about what you're photographing and why, you're in a different relationship to whatever context you're working in. So there's that. And then I think that you can extrapolate from that a certain attentiveness to formal properties of balance and proportion and light and shade and, those things, I guess. It's useful, isn't it, to be exercising those kind of muscles. Um, I must say that when I teach it, I almost never do we directly deal with what's usually called architectural photography. Like that's not that interesting. That's not actually that interesting to me, except in certain instances. There are people who are in, but it tends to be when photographers are kind of coming into it from a slightly different angle.
Hmm.
And of course, a lot of it is different tastes. Like just certain things resonate and certain things don't. Um, Students are all, I don't know, I think students are like, there's a lot of interest always. I think just, and again, on just a basic level, because people like taking pictures with their phone, and then a lot of people are more interested in it more deeply. Um, I also think, I mean, maybe this seems very reductive, but there's a way in which you can frame it that you can actually learn quite a bit quite quickly. So that you,
Hmm.
like, here, look, we can, like, you can do a course where you run through, quickly through 19th century origins of photography into the sort of 20th century era. You can focus on America and you can do phases of things. You can introduce a lot of very important work. You can introduce more interesting work. Um, so that is the way I tend to do it, actually. It's quite like, here's really good things to look at. And we spend a lot of time looking at photo books
Yeah. And
and going closely. And when you start looking at them closely,
Mhm.
this is what's interesting as well, is you really start to notice things. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not hard to look at Robert Frank's The Americans and
Mm.
see things in it that you wouldn't see if you were just running through it, like preponderance of jukeboxes and hats and, a certain way of framing the back of of figures or whatever. I can remember students doing very good studies of these things. And that's so to a certain extent, it's also, I think, it just expands your frame of reference, which is a good thing. Um,
Well, I guess it teaches you, it might do this thing where it actually teaches you to look.
it teaches you to look, yeah, and
Yeah.
spend time looking,
Yeah.
almost without purpose.
Yeah.
It's an interesting. I mean, this is not name dropping because it's not particularly interesting names in some ways, but during lockdown, first phase lockdown, at that time we were connected to um, Stephen Hall's office because they were supposed to be doing a building for us in UCD, which didn't pan out, which may or may not be a good thing. We leave that to one side, but a very interesting. The main architect in his office is Chris McVoy. It was very interesting, very good architect, and big friends of Iwan Ban, the photographer. So we had they both came on and talked about, Iwan Ban talked about his work. to the students, which I'm sure you've seen him talk. I mean, he's a very engaging guy. But I remember asking at one point, like, because he photographs as he does almost every architect's buildings now, right? You know, and he photographs in this particular way where he's coming out of his background, which is in sociology, and he's photographing the place and the context. And so I was asking whether they ever thought of commissioning him to make photographs in advance of a project. Do you know what I mean? As a way of actually seeing the territory, which the minute you start thinking about it, you think, yeah, actually that'd be better, wouldn't it? You know, because
Or you mean
or
the
it could be better.
context? You mean the context without the building?
The context without the building, and the
Ah.
context as a way of beginning to like as a way of beginning to see the context, so that you could then. So I haven't actually done anything with that, but I thought it could be very interesting. I don't know if it's ever really been done. I mean, you obviously people take record photographs of a site, or even more explorative photographs, but to have somebody who's, I mean, for very practical reasons, you know, like who's going to pay a photographer to take the photograph before the building is done, you know, or as a means of getting at the building. But I think there's something in it, you know.
There is something in it because it's about looking at the site through eyes that know how to look in a very specific way.
Let's see in a very specific way. Yeah. Let's see qualities. You know, I know these are very qualitative words, but they're seeing things that are, but they can see them and they can show you them because they make the photograph. So there's a sort of evidence, you know, the way the relationship of photography to evidence is interesting, right? Because it's a kind of evidence always. So it has that kind of element of certainty to it, but at the same time, it's qualitative, it's interpretive, it's kind of open. But it's not, it's very often, I think, that people like would come away from a site visit, say, and there will be a photograph they'd taken, maybe by accident almost, that for them becomes, yeah, okay, that's interesting. That helps me to see it, you know. So that goes to the thing of looking and and possibly, I mean, one might argue maybe that if we're if the profession is now more centrally involved with questions of care, reuse, maintenance, looking after what we have, paying more attention, then maybe photography is one of the tools that.
Yes.
So actually, at the moment, the way the research is the way I'm trying to get the research to go in as part of a sort of network of people looking at this is, we have this research network which is called Site Care, Site CARE, critical. I have to try to remember what it means. Critical approaches to recording and something else, evaluating.
Environment? Oh, evaluation.
So site, critical approaches to recording and evaluating sites.
Okay.
So what we're trying to say is that you bring in photography and film, particularly lens-based media, as a way of precisely what we're just talking about, making sense of sites, particularly, let's say, complex sites or with contested heritage or abandoned and they're seemingly worthless, you know. So because that's the other thing is photographs are good at establishing value, aren't they? Like, you're not looking at this, you should look at this, and once you look at it, you can see the quality in it. So there's that, and I'm also interested in the uses of photography in on site, like during the processes of construction or even during processes of demolition and construction. And there's quite a body of literature on that. I mean, and there's more that could be said, for good or bad, like of the, you know, on the one hand, the kind of like the sort of ruin porn sort of world, you know, that and on the other hand, using things like stop motion and to record progress on site, you know, and like the linking of those things to BIM models and this kind of thing, so that you're, you know, there's a lot of those technologies at the moment.
Well, the technological development feeding into that kind of observation and looking.
So photography is constantly monitoring progress relative to a BIM model, and I mean, you get into all kinds of questions about surveillance and
I mean, too, when I started doing research about this. Well, given that I received the fellowship, you know, obviously one of my quick reference points was, let's see who's there at University College Dublin and what they might be doing.
Yeah.
And actually, you were one of the first people that I was like, oh, immediately thinking, well, this is the kind of person that I would be talking to if I was in London. I at the AA teach a course where we actually use film to observe. I mean, many students actually then use photography. We keep it quite open, kind of Chris Marker type of sequential photographs that form a narrative, and so we do all sorts of things like that. But in any case, I very much immediately understood that you have an interest, that you have a similar kind of sensibility. So then this fellowship in the name of Shane's is the way I hope to approach it, and the way I've actually presented my kind of proposal actually was to explore this idea of influence. And I told you this in email, within our profession. And maybe before, I guess before maybe I even kind of put that influence in relation to Shane, who always very generously talks about his influences, and he generously influences other people who then kind of acknowledge his influence. I was talking to Neil McLaughlin the day before yesterday. And but before that, maybe I just like the final kind of reflection on this medium that you're so passionate about, photography, is also the kind of ability of photograph to influence
Yes.
and to kind of have this impact. And so I
Yeah.
just wonder, before we maybe talk about Shane or influence more broadly, I'd like you to maybe reflect on influence in relation to the medium, which has that built-in potential.
I think it's a tricky one, because the minute you start taking a photograph into discourse, I mean, this is what I think is maybe if we want to take issue with the standard references, the Roland Barthes and the Susan Sontag, the minute it is taken into discourse, something about the way it works is gone, if you know what I mean, because it's now being described, and it's now being reduced to punctum and something, or a quasi text, and the point is, it's not that. The point is, it's image, you know, but it's image of piece of world given back to us in a way. So I think that it's precisely because it sits in that it resists it can only exist in its own terms, if you know what I mean. Like and the means are so limited in photography, because if we, in the classic version of it, all you can do is point a device at a piece of the world and you know, capture it permanently on a piece of paper. That's all you have. I think something, when an image is made in that way, that somehow seems full or has something about it that escapes the like John Berger writes about, having just given out about people writing about, John Berger writes about it very well, like where he's saying that there's something about the sort of the cross section, that if it's just a meeting of like a certain moment in time cut across by making of a photograph, but actually a significant photograph somehow expands its cross section of meaning beyond that moment. Do you know what I mean? That's a very simplified way of saying it, but I think those images percolate and infiltrate your head, and do they have influence? I think they do, because I think they shift the way you see the world, or they shift your sense of the like, often the kind of, like, I mean, one of my favorite is Rinko Kawachi, if you know Rinko Kawachi, the Japanese photographer, wonderful photographer, and a lot of her photographs are just of moments of in-betweenness, or a sort of the wonder of things coming into being, and she makes beautiful sequences where you're just getting these funny rhymes between a pile of bicycles and the veins on the back of a hand and something else and something else, and it's just, and they're all fragments, and they're like, yeah, I guess that is a thing that you see, but I would
They're
never.
almost abstractions.
They're almost abstractions, but they're not studied abstraction either.
Yeah.
They are. It's like this is the world before it has coalesced into fixed,
Yes.
known form, or familiar, before it coalesced into the familiar. So it's some, but by virtue of that, it's actually more like, and you say, oh, that's actually what the world is like. You know what I mean? It's like, wow. So there's some act in the making of the photographs has made something, has allowed you to see something anew or afresh, or as if for the first time. And then I think those things stay with you, you know. It is amazing, like the way you register photographs. And like, I mean, sorry, this is bits from my book, so I kind of have thought
Yeah,
about
yeah,
these,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
I mean, there's a brilliant photograph which is around here somewhere by Helen Levitt, which you probably know, of a girl. It's generally called Spider Girl, or Girl with a Green Car. Like, so there's a green car, one of her color photographs, green car in the background, and a girl turning to look into a hubcap of a car. So like my mangled description of it is terrible, but the minute you see the picture, it's like, oh, oh, what a thing.
Mhm.
But you can't, like, you can't describe it. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like, it's not a significant thing. It's not an important thing.
Mhm.
It's not a political thing, in a like in a Carrie Mae Weems standing in front of monuments. It's not overtly anything,
Mhm.
but it is. I don't know. I think it makes you. It's something to do with empathy, maybe.
Mhm.
Like, it encourages a kind of empathy.
Understanding or
Yeah, fellow feeling as well.
feeling. Yeah.
Feeling, you know what I mean? Like, there's some act of identification. Even
Yeah.
if looking at the picture, you're
Yeah.
in the
Yeah. Yeah.
mode of, oh yeah, okay, I see value, I see
Mm.
individual.
Emotion, even
Say again?
emotion. Emotion.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah,
There is a response, a
there's a
kind of
response.
bodily,
Yeah,
visceral.
yeah,
Um,
there's a response, and that thing is like, then. So when you see it again, you think, oh yeah, that picture. You know, just once, and then you see it again. You know, that picture. You know, that picture.
mhm.
Um, so I guess that's influence. I mean, of a kind. You know, it's not subliminal. I don't think it's subliminal. I think it's kind of active and conscious,
Mhm.
but it's not. It hasn't settled into discourse, as I say, or explanation or rationale. It's somehow before those things, and that's like, it's tricky for us in architecture to get at that, because our tendency is to want to be. We have to describe fully, you know, flesh out.
If you just put in context how architects think in a kind of professional sense,
Yeah.
or what their duty of care is, or what their and then if you think of the kind of emotive response to a photograph,
Yeah.
um, yeah, there's some. I mean, there's there's a certain disconnect. I feel. I don't know.
Between them. Yeah, but well, I don't, you see, I mean, there is an emotive aspect to it, but I don't know, I think empathy is probably better, which is this, and which, you know, if you go back to Nietzsche, say, and this kind of, this idea of fellow feeling,
Hmm.
which actually sometimes in empathy theory does get connected into architecture, doesn't it? Because there's the notion of a rhyme between um, a space and how, and our feelings, if you like. That's what trying to remember the names of the guys. Uh, you'll know, like late 19th century, same era as Nietzsche. Oh, name's gone out of my head. But there was a whole body of work, and there was a number of um, people writing about it at that time, just trying to establish. It was coming from Heinrich Wulfflin, so he's the kind of father of that, and that made its way into quite a lot of early 20th century. Peter Frankel and people like this talking about Paul Frankel, sorry, talking about architecture, trying to, even to an extent, Frank Lloyd Wright, I think.
Okay.
Um, So this understanding of the sort of a certain reciprocity between space and the inhabitant, if you like, and that you were playing with that and amplifying that in terms of the space, in terms of spatial journeys, progression, that kind of thing. So I think the alertness to the world and how we are in it that you get from photography, that's what I think is it feeds into the way we make architecture in certain ways.
Yeah, have you recognized any of that sensibility in practice? I mean, you worked.
Oh, in practice, yeah. I don't. Oh gosh.
If I take you back to what was it, late 80s that you
Oh,
were?
when working with Shane.
I mean, maybe I don't
That,
know.
well, I mean,
Shane started his Royal Academy lecture when he won this Royal Academy Award last year. He started it with a photograph of that door into that small building on the outskirts of Casino.
oh yeah. Yeah. He gave that lecture again in Dublin, which was nice. Although I missed the very beginning of it, so I missed that door.
The door,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, it's funny because yeah, I worked there for 4 years straight after I came out of college. Like that was it. There was no. I was in London. There was no work in Dublin, but they suddenly had some work, and then so that was they. I got Shane had taught me, like he taught Neil, and
At UCD, he did.
yeah, GCD. So he would have been in the
Oh,
like
nice.
we had a thesis year. Now the way that we organize it is there's a sort of year long thesis, or was organized then. There was a year long thesis. There were two people who were sort of in charge of the whole year, which as it happens was him and Yvonne Farrell from Grafton Architects. And
Okay.
then John Toomey was my you had a tutor then, like an individual supervisor, you're right. So John Toomey was my supervisor. So it was kind of like the this in retrospect, that was pretty good, right? As a as a group. Um so then I went into work for Shane, but I like, and I guess the standard, and I was thinking about your thing of influence, because the standard narrative is Can, isn't it? I mean, it's that's the like he's so steeped in Can, and I know that when he came back into UCD like in his earlier days of teaching in UCD, I think he was very much bringing that, um, whatever you want to call it. Not, I no, I was going to say gospel, but that's not right. It was more like a way of thinking about architecture deeply. He was bringing that in, and he was really firing students up. He
Mm-hmm.
really was, like all of like particularly that, like John, Sheila, Jelly, Yvonne, all of them. He was
Do
in
you
the
think they
first.
were all? Do you think they were all influenced or like in some way responding to Shane's maybe in some way?
Yeah, channeling Can, channeling. Like, I mean, it sounds very reductive and a bit superficial, but I don't think it was. I think it was just like because the way Louis Kahn teaches, I think, is is like he's just trying to find a way of understanding this thing that we're trying to make, and it can feel very mysterious and high flown sometimes, but actually I think at other times it's very simple and kind of straightforward. Um and so like actually there's a real kind of directness about the like, or what I found interesting about working with Shane, very frustrating person to work with a lot of the time, but there was just a kind of directness about the way he thought about questions of what is a window in a wall and how would you make one. Like if I'm sure you were the same coming out of college. I really had no idea. Like I knew notionally what building technology was and how you put windows in walls, but I hadn't thought about it philosophically, or not even philosophically, but from first principles kind of, um oh, that this is a thing, right? That this is a question worth dwelling, worth sitting with, and
Yeah.
worth drawing a lot, and worth really pursuing. Um, so that kind of, and then a real deliberateness about the kind of drawing you would make. Like you would make a 1 to 2, and you would make a 1 to 20, and you would make a 1 to 200.
Oh, okay.
Only those scales. Like if you look at those, I'm sure you probably have that very, very big book that they made of all their drawings. If you haven't, you should see it. Do you know?
I've seen it. I've seen
Yeah,
it.
that.
But I don't have it.
But my memory of now a little bit later on in working there was the project in Cork, the first phase of that library. That was like 1 to 2, 1 to 20, 1 to 200. That's it. Um, so 1 to 2 is all the like of the wall section. That's like how it meets the ground, how you make a sill, how you make a lintel, how you make um an
Yes, yes,
upstand,
yes.
right? That's it. Boom, boom, boom. And then 1 to 20 is going to give you the lineaments of the thing of how it meets the structure and how the space is made.
Mhm.
And then 1 to 200 is arrangement of the space. So and a lot of the 1 to 2s would have been drawn on the walls of the studio. Like 1 to 2 is just such a silly scale to draw.
Yeah, it's. I mean, this is giving me a lot of thought. I wasn't
Yeah,
necessarily thinking of that. This
yeah,
is going to be something I'll be thinking about, but it
yeah.
is interesting that you skip sort of. I mean, okay, 1 to 2 is a bit of a bigger version of 1 to 5, but
It's
skipping
so
1 to 50 and 1 to 100, it's
yeah.
interesting that.
Giving them no, because it's not like because well, I mean in kind of Cannian terms, like the organism, I guess, is set
Yeah,
at
yeah, yeah, yeah.
the 1 to 200, and then the interesting thing is, how does that present itself as rooms or spaces?
Exactly. How does it manifest directly? I think there's something that is that there's quite that you use the word directness,
Yeah,
and I think this is also very direct. That you
yeah.
go from 1 to 200 to 1 to 20. There's something very direct about that. It's like we're not fluffing about. There is this
No,
and
we're not talking about, and actually, like it's a misdirection to think. Like if you remember, like sure, like in thesis, you're so you can get into that 1 to 100 scale, and you're just so bound up with that kind of thing of the design drawings, that kind of phase. But it's more like, no, that's not really where the business is. The business is in the 1 to 2 because you really need to know every brick and how then the sill sits relative to the brick and how that, you know what I mean, all of it. On the one hand, and then on the other hand, you need to just understand how the whole thing operates relative to a larger ensemble and whatever. Now it wouldn't always be that repertoire, but it could be a different repertoire. But I do, remember like
yeah.
the rethink, and I think that comes from working with Can. I imagine it does because, as I say, I think Can is really pragmatic in a lot of ways, very direct.
Mhm.
But like zoning, like or whatever, zooming in or homing in on the consequential, if you
Mhm.
like, the
So,
thing that will make the difference.
yeah. So
Yeah.
when did Shane teach you in 1 year of your education at some
Yeah,
point
and fine in the final year.
in
Yeah.
the
So
final
at
year?
that stage, so I don't quite know. You'd have to dig, I'm sure, to find out where he was teaching at various points. I know he started in teaching in first year, and that's where, as I say, he met a lot of those students. But by the time I got him, he was in final year, kind of overseeing, Um,
Well, Neil said that he taught him in first year and in fourth year or fifth or
Okay,
whatever.
so then that's
Yeah,
probably that he was
there was a
catching it in
point
that
where he.
transition. Yeah, yeah. So, but I didn't have him in first year, and I say it was kind of he's not a very like as you would imagine as you know he's not a very um chatty or easy figure like Yvonne was a good foil because she's all of those things. Um, but it feels important
Mm,
what he's
mm.
talking.
And it feels like all these different characters there at the same time, and of course it's a generation of architects that
Yeah,
really emerge now in Ireland and do amazing work internationally.
yeah.
Um,
But
yeah.
Shane is the enabling, not the only one, but he's a really important enabling figure for them. Like he's older than them, not that much older, but he's older than John, Sheila, Shelley, Yvonne, Neil McCullough, um, Derek Tynan is another one, like all of those.
Mhm.
Yeah, we should not ever forget John Marr, because the two of them
Absolutely.
together is really important. But the two competitions they did, say for the churches, you would have seen those in the early 70s, and built
And the Taoiseach's house
the
competition.
Taoiseach's House competition, which is just those fantastic drawings, and like that has real impact,
Mm.
in a place where there's commercial architecture, some
Mhm.
of it of good quality, and then there's architecture in other places in the world. That's it. Like, so for this to be coming in Ireland is like, okay, this feels like the beginning of something. I mean, I'm not dismissing the commercial architecture, because the commercial architecture, and particularly the influence of Mies is very strong and very significant and really good quality. But I think for that generation of Graftons and O'Donnell Toomey, as they became, what Shane and John were doing was showing a way of making an architecture that was more European,
Mhm.
more. I mean, not just as I say them, but it also seemed to link a little bit to their interest in Rossi and,
Yeah.
later career, I guess, in
Yes. 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 Yes.
Norwich City.
But there
You
are elements of
bang.
postmodernism. Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
So all of that stuff there, like Shane is the person who seems to be giving that some form, and actually, if you look back at it from there, and then making the work in Trinity, the first phase of work, the dining hall and the atrium, like they loomed large as projects in Ireland,
Mhm.
inevitably, because there was not a lot of what we would have thought of as contemporary architecture of
Or this
significance.
kind of very fine work.
Yeah, and it still is. If you like, I've gone back there quite a lot recently, and like, you still is like, yeah, it's got real.
Contemporary.
But still, it still has just real quality, and
Yeah.
it feels like very considered and highly achieved um work. So
And one thing I asked Neil was, obviously this was Neil was telling me about how the sort of the educational system worked, that he was saying how you would copy, let's say, a drawing of Mies, and then you would pin up all the copies of whatever 50 students, and you would have a discussion about that in first year or so. But I think of course, we don't do that now. And I feel like even the way I teach is in some way, obviously, like, I take a lot from my teachers, but I also correct some of the things that I think weren't done
yeah,
properly.
yeah,
And so I just wonder, maybe in the way that you teach, and you've come from that school and you've been taught by all these people,
yeah.
what are those things that you're taking, and then what are those things that you're correcting?
Correcting. Yeah. Well, I mean, if I think about my own trajectory, I mean, was. Like, I would have been like, I don't think I was a terribly good student for a long time, and then I kind of got a sense of how it was done late on, and sort of did pretty well. But it was very much design focused. It was design, design, design. The other aspects, theoretical, historical, were kind of fine, interesting, but not the things that drove me. And then working with Shane, actually simultaneously working with Shane and getting much more like exposure to this, much more obviously thoroughgoing and deep and detailed engagement with building. I was actually kind of becoming disenchanted with that as much as learning from it, so that I was kind of trying to then find, okay, but how do we think about architecture in relation to, let's say, post-colonial theory was very big at the time in Ireland, as you can imagine.
Or
Should be thinking about architecture in relation to all these other wider discourses. We shouldn't be so narrowly focused. So actually, so that's what I went back to start doing research degrees and so on, was actually a sort of moving away from the focus on the architecture, and it was way more on the focus on the context that produces it.
Mhm.
And in a way, so if we were looking at the anxiety of influence, it probably was that on the one hand, you're trying to run away from that. And then it keeps coming back, because then you realize actually these people are already in dialogue with all of this stuff. Do you know?
Yeah, and there
Oh,
is a value, and there is
one
a.
can think about this work in relation to those contexts, and it's
Mhm.
still you can. So it's probably like a sort of it's a dialectic, isn't it? Actually, like that you're going back and forth between the the the
Mhm.
what the context that's producing it and the thing itself. And then, so like, so what you would find yourself on at times, as you say, kind of correcting or wanting to expand the field of reference, or say, well, let's not get fixated on the sense of judgment. Like you get frustrated by people talking about people's judgment and their feel for things, and you gotta go, no, 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 come on, no, like let's go. What about the conditions of production and blah blah blah? But then on the other hand, at other stages think, well, hang on, but let's think about the building a bit more, So like let's think folks like you go draw 1 to 2 detail, because maybe that will embody everything you want about
Yes, yeah.
the context and the conditions and all, society at this moment. So I think it is there's a sort of counterbalance. The other thing I would say, having then gone to London and taught with ERNA for a couple of years and more broadly, in Ireland, there's this kind of regard for I'm going to say the canon. I don't mean that in a conservative way. There's a regard for reference, precedent, really knowing stuff, like really knowing
History. History.
history and the repertoire, so to speak. You know it. Like they all know it. All those people, they just know all the core buildings and they know all the can buildings and like they know them. And not that they're going to copy them, but they just feel that that's got real value. And I'm
Mhm.
not saying that's not the case in the UK, but I don't think it's a way of teaching uh,
No.
to anything like the same extent.
Mhm. Mhm. But I think the interesting word that you used is the word expansion. So maybe that's the kind of role of a student to expand
Yeah,
when they become a teacher one day is to actually expand.
push it. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
there's always a desire to push and expand,
Mm.
but then at the same time, it's always a sort of negotiation with the value of the thing that you
Mhm.
as well. Do you know what I mean? You're trying to assimilate. Okay, well, I'm not entirely comfortable with the way that that's been presented to me, but I've got to go and find a way of getting it to make sense for me, which is
Mhm.
shifting the terms a bit or expanding the context but generally speaking, it ends up you see the value of it, and I do see the value certainly of all those. Like I'm very glad that I spent that time working there because
Mhm.
like I still am,
It's really important. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so.
What did you work on when you were
What
which
did I work on? Yeah. I wanted my first day in DeBlacam and Meagher. I went well, this is more about Shane, not about Shane, but about John Meagher. I went with John Meagher, the partner, down to Knock in the west of Ireland. We flew to look at the site for this chapel competition. The competition for Knock is a big shrine, like there's loads and loads of pilgrims. So it was very unusual called the Chapel of Reconciliation. It's a big competition, open competition for where they would cycle people through confession. So it's a church which is entirely surrounded by confessionals on all 4 sides, and the landscape. So that was the first thing I worked on was the competition drawings for that.
Yeah, I
And we
think I've seen a
only
drawing of that. The big
yeah
square with loads of.
thing in the background that was me late at night. Not very nice drawings really, but we won. So we won that, and then I worked on that, and then I worked in Trinity on the site. If you know the Beckett Theatre, and then there's residences beside that I worked on, and then I worked on the Temple Bar competition,
Mhm.
interestingly, and
Mhm.
which obviously we didn't win. And
Yeah.
then I worked on the Cork buildings, the
Okay.
very with Mary Laheen, like before they were built, though. I was
Mhm.
gone by the time they were on site.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
It's always interesting to kind of have a bit of, I guess, understand a little bit about projects that are in the practice at the same time, because
yeah.
there's always a lot of, I guess,
Well, so yeah, that like that
relation.
the way the office was organized, and I'm sure you heard this, is like there was very much Shane's work, John's work, and John was restaurants and houses,
Mm-hmm.
clients, very important. And John was a really good architect, and brought in a lot of Scandinavian,
Mm-hmm.
Alto, certainly Asplund, Leverance, Asplund particularly hugely important to both of them actually.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they, and then Shane was the big,
Institutional.
the
Yeah.
big institutional clients. Yeah. You know, probably you might say the prestige projects, or the ones that'll get published.
Yeah. And Hugh, maybe my last question, again, I think back to this idea that there's been an emergence of architects, whether you want to call them a scene. I think somehow it does feel a little bit like a scene, looking at
Yeah.
it from London,
Yeah.
because it's a group. It's a very kind of defined group that do incredible work. But what would you say is that thing that allowed, you actually said it, actually Shane had a lot to do with it, but what is that kind of Irish condition that is reflected in this work or this group? Something that is uniquely Irish, as well as, you know, even the fact that, you know, when I was looking at all these people I want to talk to, they all come from one school of
Yeah.
architecture.
Yeah.
So what is that? How would you describe that? What are those parameters that define this group?
I think it's like a version of the minor literature idea, isn't it? It's like Ireland has this always marginal but close relationship to larger neighbors, England, the Anglo, the US, Europe, which means that has to pay attention to all of them. So it ends up knowing a lot, you know, because you have to, because you know what I mean? You don't feel that you're the center ever. So we need to know what's happening in the UK and in Europe and in America, because they're all relevant to our condition. So that means we're very versatile and conversant in if you know what I mean, on a number of fronts. So what can happen then, though, that can feel like a sort of, as I say, a kind of marginal condition, but actually when you have the opportunity, it becomes a strength, because actually you know a shitload, frankly. And I mean, I would think that's what characterizes Graftons, for instance. They can operate in any context because they understand they know how to, let's say, negotiate and navigate with complex bodies of knowledge, and they can switch it from Sweden to the US to
Italy.
Italy to Italy. Yeah, and in each case, it's genuine, if you know what I mean, as well. It's something. There's something I don't want to say authentic, sincere is a better word about it as an approach. Sincere interest, willingness to meet a condition, if you know what I mean, to come from where you are towards it, which is, if you're sitting in the metropolitan center, doesn't feel like a precondition for making work, right? Because you're in the middle of it. I think France is the same, right? You know, yeah, we're France. Like, why would we come to meet this condition that we don't know about? I think that's part of it. And then combine that with scale. Yes, okay, so one school. I mean, there were two schools at the time, but really, I mean, there was one that was a significant center for education. So of course they all went to the same school. Where else would they have come from? You know? And of course they all knew each other because it was a small number. So again, and then the sort of in the case of that particular group or generation, opportunity at the right moments, opportunities to teach, which all of them got. And that would have been a little bit through Shane, but mostly through Cathal O'Neill, who was the head at the time, like not an Alvin Bajarski figure, but let's say something equivalent in terms of trying to bring new voices in. And then at a certain point through Temple Bar, they all got to build. They became a collective, and then they all got to build a significant building out of that project. Which, if you think about it, it's like that's just a hit. That's a big, big, big thing, because now suddenly it just pushes you from, for all of them, they made the buildings that were like, say, the equivalent of, I don't know, Tony Fretton doing the Listen Gallery. And then that's, oh, everybody goes to see the Listen Gallery, and it's a thing. Like, it's establishing it is a kind of a scene. Like, again, that Tony Fretton scene. So there was some of that is just luck and circumstance and timing and where the economy was. But I think the larger thing is that thing of the condition of Ireland, and you find it in literature as well. No, that there's a great strength there.
Yeah, and there's always this notion that if you read the Dubliners, it always says the character is always instructed to go away, go look, go see the world.
Yeah, yeah, and I think there's still that openness to almost you might say expectation, but certainly, like even now, say 80% of our students will go on Erasmus. They all go. They'll go somewhere, and they'll go somewhere to work. That's fine. Like, that's just part of it. It's like, it's open.
Yeah.
Whereas, again, if I go to UK schools and you say to students, "Are you going somewhere?" No, they're not interested in going somewhere. I go, really? Wow. Have you been to Port? Like, have you been to all the places? So, like, I still think that to when you're on the edge, I think you find it with Eastern European actually schools and students as well, really conversant with a whole lot of stuff. They speak about
how much they know.
Yeah, how much?
They know nuanced differences between London schools.
Exactly. Yeah.
How do you know that?
Yeah, how do you know that? Because it's like, that's the thing, because we read about all this. I don't think that's as strongly the case as it used to be, as you can imagine, because everything is accessible and blah blah blah. But at that moment, it was like, So John Toomey, when Sheila coming out of the school and they go to London, and John goes to work for James Sterling and Sheila goes to study in the RCA with Kenneth Frampton, kind of course they do, because they know like that, the value of that, and so on. And they're sort of targeting it. And they're willing to, that's exactly like Chinese students would do now, or whatever. They'd know it, and they'd know that they're conversant with it. That's what I think is, and that's Neil is part of that. Absolutely, like a bit more independent, actually, Neil, but but still very connected.
Absolutely, because I mean, Shane went to America for a reason, right?
Shane went to America for a reason. And like, there was a whole bunch of them, not a whole bunch of them. There was a few of them, because John went to America as well. John worked with Venturi,
Exactly. Yes.
And Cathal O'Neill, who I mentioned, who was the head, worked with Mies, and a few people went to study with Mies, work with Mies. They're looking for it. They're looking for the bigger, and they know they can't get all of it in Ireland, if you like. So therefore, you're always expanding, and there's a sort of hunger, I think, that comes with it as well. But then at the same time, an understanding that you can bring that back and you can make sense of it. Like, you reference Joyce. Joyce is the ultimate example of it, isn't it? It's like, it's all about Dublin, but it's everything. It's all about
the whole world. Yeah.
Whole world. Yeah.